Hi, my name is Rolland Vaive, and I'd like to talk to you today about the Canadian tax system in general. And kind of a theme within that is the complexity of the Canadian tax system and some of the calls that have been coming out recently about the simplification of the tax system. So I want to start with an interesting quote. There's a quote that says, and this is a famous quote, you can Google it, "The hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax." And that quote, believe it or not, came from Albert Einstein. And when he did make that quote, I don't know the year, there's no year attributed to it, but it was a long time ago. And if you think the income tax was difficult to understand in Einstein's period, you can imagine just how much more complicated it is. In general terms, I'm a tax accountant by training. That's what I do. We love to, talk badly about our Canadian tax system or tax system in general. As a whole, as a piece of legislation, it's very complicated. It's, the Income Tax Act itself. You have all kinds of interpretations and rulings. You have case law layered on top of that. So it's not just a document, a big set of rules that's called the Income Tax Act. There's tax treaties involved. So it's a whole bunch of pieces of legislation and case law that goes with it. So it's more than just a big book of rules. It's constantly evolving and it's constantly getting bigger. Legislation changes over time. It generally adapts to new things that are out there. I mean, e-commerce, for example, back in 1917, when the Income Tax Act was first introduced in Canada, e-commerce didn't really apply then. And even going back 10 or 15 years ago, e-commerce was not nearly where it is today. So that's just an example. I'm not saying that there's a lot of the changes in the Income Tax Act that relate strictly to e-commerce, but that's an example of how the tax legislation, the Tax Act, has to keep up with changing times. In terms of the way that legislation is released in Canada, traditionally it's been very well thought out, and I'll get back to the traditional part. Traditionally, it's been very well thought out. Some very fine minds in the finance department in Canada that are constantly looking for problems with the legislation. They've got their ear to the ground in terms of some of the transactions that are going on out there that are perhaps not kosher, that really are a misuse of the Income Tax Act. So part of what they do is they kind of look at what the tax community and the business community is doing, and they'll try and make the system fairer. And that's a very well thought out process. Internally they draft legislation. It's very well vetted. One of the big concerns you've got when you're drafting new tax legislation is how it's going to interact with other provisions of the Income Tax Act. So you may want to perhaps fix a problem that's out there, or make something, or create, or fix an injustice. It's not always, fixing problems that are out there. There are some injustices in the Tax Act that they want to fix. So it does go both ways. So in the course of fixing one problem or plugging one hole, you don't want to create a whole bunch of unintended side effects. So typically what happens is internally, the finance department will, vet this legislation. They'll release it as a notice of ways and means motion. Sometimes it's done as part of a budget release. A lot of times it's just done at various times throughout the year. It's released, and sometimes it takes effect immediately, but a lot of cases it's here's what we're going to do. They release it to the tax community, and both the Canadian Bar Association, CPA Canada, some of the bodies out there will look at it. They'll provide feedback, and quite often we'll see changes that are done to the legislation, because yes, it might fix a problem or two, but it creates other problems that, regardless of how fine the minds are that are drafting it, they can't see the whole picture. So it is very much a collaborative process between the finance department and the tax community, and that ecosystem has existed for a number of years. What we're starting to see now is, and most recently there was some legislation that was released in July 2017, and to the average person, it made a little bit of headlines, but it was a fairly comprehensive set of proposals that they put out there. And the sense we got was that a couple of things. It was far too complex, and I'll deal with the complexity part of it, but it didn't seem to be very well thought out. And, some of these proposals, while trying to fix some perceived loopholes, in fact, because it just seemed rushed, and it seemed to create more downstream secondary problems than we've seen typically ever, to be honest with you. So I think what we're seeing now is, although traditionally it's been a well thought out process, and I still hold on to that concept, I think we're starting to see some things that are perhaps more politically motivated. And what ends up happening, I think, is we're seeing legislation that might be a little rushed to get out the door and that sort of thing. The concept is that the tax system should be understandable to most people. I mean, you would hope that someone would be able to understand the tax system in a way that they can do their own taxes. I think we're getting close to the point now, maybe not on the personal side, but definitely on a corporate side, where I don't think the average person can do their own tax return unless their situation is really, really straightforward. The complexity of what you have to know and the ever-changing nature of it, we're starting to get to the point where certainly doing your own corporate tax return would be really difficult to do. And we're almost getting to the point where I'm having more and more difficulty explaining to people what is on their tax return. I pride myself on being able to take some fairly complex tax concepts and distill them down to something that the average person can understand. And we're getting to the point now where that's really difficult to do because the concepts are so complicated. And some of the terminology and lexicon that we use is that it's almost becoming incomprehensible, and we're seeing fewer and fewer people who can actually understand what's going on. Particularly following these July 2017 proposals, there was a cry by the tax community to saying these new rules that you're proposing, they're just far too complicated. Let's slow things down. Let's undertake a comprehensive review of the Canadian tax system, and let's do this in a more structured and comprehensive way. The last real major overhaul of the Canadian tax system was in 1972, and they started that process in the late 60s. So back then, when they essentially rewrote the Income Tax Act, it took them years and years to kind of look at it from the ground up and look at every step of the changes in the system and rethink it. So there's been a lot of cries for that by the tax community. And again, some of the things that they're saying is that this is becoming far too complicated. We have to slow things down. Now, I think there's a little bit of a hypocrisy in that statement. The reason the tax system is so complicated is because of tax practitioners themselves who have devised these techniques to get results which were never intended. And if you kind of look back at, if you take the Income Tax Act right now and kind of pull out those sections which are so difficult to understand, there's almost a direct tracing of those rules to things that people have done. People who are paid good money to come up with ways to circumnavigate the system. So when I think it's somewhat rich when my peers in the tax community say, hold on a second, we're things are getting out of control. We have to scale things back. We have to simplify the system. We have to look at things comprehensively. I think that is somewhat. It's rich for them to say that, and I'm probably going to take a lot of heat for saying that. But we're our own worst enemy. The reason the Income Tax Act is as complicated as it is, in part because the world has become more complicated. Transnational, transborder transactions are more common. There's a lot more complexity in the financial world, so that does account for a lot of the changes. But a significant part of it is really things that we have done in the tax world, and we've brought this upon ourselves. I think that's fair to say. And the other thing that, again, these calls for comprehensive review are basically asking for like give us 4 or 5 years while you think things through, so we continue with the old ways, and do all of these wonderful tax saving measures while you think things through. So I think a lot of the calls for simplification and comprehensive reviews are just an excuse to buy more time so they can continue with the status quo. There's this concept of the tax loophole. That L word is really not a good word. There are, in my mind, very few loopholes in the Income Tax Act. There's lots of provisions of the Act which allow people to get really good results, but to call them loopholes would basically be saying that the people who drafted the legislation didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't think things through. A lot of the quote-unquote loopholes, and Minister Morneau used that word when he tried to roll out this legislation in 2017. He basically said, we're trying to plug all of these loopholes, which was nonsense. These were well-established, well-understood provisions of the Income Tax Act that were working exactly as intended. And for political reasons, it's easy to refer to the evil business owners who are getting all of these great results while the average worker with a T4 has to pay a lot of tax. So he called them loopholes. And I think that was offensive to a lot of people in the tax community, because, you might say, okay, the good times are over. You can't continue to enter into some of these transactions, and we're going to stop that. But to call them loopholes would imply that they were unintended. And in fact, it was the exact opposite. They were built into the tax system. They were there to achieve a specific result. And people were using them, in this case, exactly as they were intended. And I think that really did offend a lot of people in the tax community by calling them loopholes. They played well politically, but I think it was quite disingenuous of them to refer to them as that. The Canadian tax system as a whole, I think, is it is no more complex than other tax systems. And in fact, I would say, if you look at our system versus the American system, if you were to poll the average person on the street, they would say that, the Canadian, tell us about the Canadian tax system versus the American tax system. And you'll hear lots of things about the Canadian system being full of red tape, full of, complexity. And there's this perception that our business-friendly neighbors to the south have this very streamlined system, which is why American business is so more successful than Canadian business. I mean, that's absolutely not the truth. In fact, I would hold up our system against theirs any day of the week. I think the Canadian system achieves more fairness. I think it is less complex than the Canadians. Our system is less complex than the American system, and they have a lot of work to do on their end. So as bad as you might think ours is in terms of complexity, I think the Canadian system is a lot less complicated than the U.S. system. The U.S. system, for example, if you're an individual, you will file a tax return in federal tax return and the state that you live in. If you happen to live in a state where there's no income tax, that's great, but most states do have an income tax. Some cities have income taxes. So, for example, if you are a professional athlete and you happen to play a hockey game in Nashville, you'll have to file, even though you are, you might be based in Canada or you might be based in New York, you'll have to file a Tennessee tax return. If you play a game in Philadelphia, you'll have to file a Pennsylvania and a Philadelphia state or a Philadelphia city tax return. So we've done a lot more work here in Canada on harmonizing things. We see that with the HST. Most provinces other than Quebec now you'll file a single personal tax return. So if you compare that to, for example, the someone who is in the U.S. and might have to file returns in the case of the absurd case of a professional athlete, they might have to file in 20 or 30 different jurisdictions. In Canada, we've spent more time, and it was painful, more time harmonizing things. Same thing with sales tax, the HST. In general, the rates vary from province to province, but the tax base, what is subject to the GST or HST is fairly consistent across the country. So I think our system is less problematic to navigate. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's still complicated. The question of simplifying that, I think, is just I don't see how you do that. I don't think in the as systems, as the business world continues to evolve, and industries and transactions that we haven't even thought of right now start to become more commonplace, as tax practitioners continue to find new ways to circumvent the system. I think I can't see any way in which the Canadian tax system will become any simpler. I think if you're looking for if you're on the side of simplifying the tax system, I think you better buckle your seatbelt, because I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's only going to get worse. So I talked about, the average person. We're getting to the stage where it's almost impossible for the average person to do their own tax return. Again, if you have a fairly simple situation, it's probably okay. But, if there's any complexity to what you're doing, I think it will become more and more difficult. If I was to look at focus, for example, on personal tax, if I was to look at our personal tax clients, they generally fall into a couple of categories. Those that probably could do their own returns, but life is short and they don't want to waste 2 weekends of their life every year doing it, so they outsource it. So, those people might have the ability to do their own tax return, they just choose not to do it. For the same reason that you might not want to wallpaper your house, you probably could do it, but you don't want to spend a couple of weekends doing it, so you have somebody who's better at it. So that takes care of a few of our clients, certainly a percentage of them. And the others are just to the point where they're either so unsure, or their situation is so elaborate and so complicated that there's no chance in hell they could actually do their own. And even if they were to attempt it and be reasonably satisfied that they did a good job, they would have this nagging feeling that perhaps they didn't do it properly. And their concerns would be the same on either side of the ledger. Concerned that they've paid too much tax, which obviously nobody wants to do, but also concerned that perhaps they didn't pay the right amount of tax, and this may come back to haunt them at a certain point in time. So again, personal tax clients for us fall into those two camps: those who probably could do it and don't want to, and those that it's just far beyond what they could reasonably expect themselves to do. And that's basically it. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I think there's a lot of discussion out there about simplification. And trust me, if the tax system could be simplified, I'd be a happy person. But I just think if you look at those factors which have created the complex system that we're now facing, those being the external business world and the efforts of my peer group, I think those are not going to go away anytime soon. And given not just this government, but any government across the world, given their desire to raise revenues, I don't think we'll ever see a simplified tax system in my lifetime, at least not in the G7 world.